It was a day that began like any other in the small town of Crestwood, where life had a habit of moving at its own slow and predictable pace. The sun was hidden behind a blanket of thick, gray clouds, casting a dull light over the quiet neighborhood. Alex, a 14-year-old boy with dark hair and wide, earnest eyes, had spent the morning quietly helping around the house as he always did. His stepmother, Karen, was busy in the kitchen, barking orders at him while she prepared for the small party she had planned for later that evening. Karen had never been warm to Alex, not since the day she married his father, Jack. She tolerated him at best and treated him with cold disdain at worst. Alex had grown used to it. His real mother had passed away when he was very young, leaving his father to raise him alone until Karen entered their lives 5 years ago. At first, Jack was ecstatic, believing Karen would fill the void in their family and bring happiness back into their home. But Alex knew better. Karen's smiles were reserved for others, her sharp words and disapproving looks always aimed at him. Jack, often busy with his job as a construction foreman, was rarely around to witness the quiet cruelty that seeped into their daily lives. That afternoon, Karen had accused Alex of something he hadn't done. It wasn't unusual. She had a habit of finding faults in the smallest of things. But today, it was different. The air in the house felt thick with tension, and Alex could sense something brewing beneath the surface. He had accidentally knocked over a glass vase while dusting the shelves in the living room. The vase shattered into pieces on the hardwood floor, and though Alex immediately began cleaning up the mess, Karen stormed in, her eyes flashing with fury. "You clumsy, useless child," she screeched, her voice echoing through the house. "Do you know how much that vase was worth? It was an heirloom from my mother." Alex flinched at the volume of her voice, his heart racing as he frantically swept the shards into a dustpan. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Sorry. Sorry isn't going to fix this," Karen interrupted, her face twisting into a sneer. "I've had enough of you. I've put up with your mistakes, your laziness, and your attitude for far too long. I want you out of this house." Alex froze, staring at her in disbelief. He had always known Karen didn't like him, but to kick him out? Surely she didn't mean it. But as he looked into her cold, unyielding eyes, he realized she was serious. "You heard me," Karen said, her voice low and dangerous now. "Pack your things and get out. I don't want to see your face when your father gets home. He'll deal with you then." Alex felt a lump forming in his throat, a mix of fear and anger swelling inside him. His father, Jack, was out of town for the weekend on a work trip, leaving Karen in charge. Alex knew his father would never approve of this, but Karen had the upper hand for now. She had always been able to manipulate situations, twisting words and events to make herself appear blameless. What would his father think when he came back? Would he take Karen's side, believing her lies? Without another word, Alex walked to his room, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his backpack and began stuffing it with clothes, his hands shaking as he packed his meager belongings. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt hostile, like a battlefield where he was hopelessly outnumbered. He could hear Karen in the kitchen, still muttering angrily to herself as she clenched pots and pans together. She was preparing for the party, acting as if nothing had happened, as if kicking him out was a normal occurrence. With his bag slung over his shoulder, Alex took one last look at his room. It wasn't much: a small bed, a desk, a few posters on the wall. But it had been his sanctuary, the one place where he felt safe. Now, it felt like he was being exiled from the only home he had ever known. As he stepped out of the front door, the cold autumn rain began to fall, a steady drizzle that soaked through his thin jacket almost immediately. Alex didn't know where to go. He didn't have many friends in the neighborhood, and the ones he did have weren't close enough to offer him a place to stay. The thought of wandering the streets, drenched and alone, made his stomach churn with dread. He walked aimlessly for a while, the rain mixing with the tears he refused to acknowledge. His mind was racing replaying the argument with Karen over and over again. How could things have gotten this bad? What had he done to deserve this? Hours passed, and as the sky darkened, Alex found himself standing in front of Mrs. Thompson's house, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. She had always been kind to him, offering him cookies or lemonade whenever he helped her with chores around her yard. Desperate, and with no other options, he knocked on her door. Mrs. Thompson opened the door, her face creasing into a concerned frown when she saw the soaked and trembling boy standing on her porch. "Alex, what on earth are you doing out here in the rain?" Alex hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. But as she ushered him inside, handing him a towel to dry off, the words spilled out of him. He told her everything. About the broken vase, Karen's outburst, and how she had thrown him out of the house. Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, her expression softening with empathy. "That woman has always been trouble," she muttered under her breath once Alex had finished. "But don't you worry, dear. You can stay here until your father gets back. We'll sort this out." Alex felt a surge of relief wash over him, grateful for Mrs. Thompson's kindness. But the relief was short-lived. In the back of his mind, he knew that the real confrontation was yet to come. What would happen when his father returned? Would he believe Karen's lies? Would he stand by his wife, or would he finally see her for who she really was? That night, Alex lay awake in the guest room, his mind buzzing with anxiety. He had always looked up to his father, admired his work ethic and sense of fairness. Jack had always been his hero, the one person Alex could rely on. But now, that trust felt fragile, like it could shatter with one wrong move. The rain continued to pour outside, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of Alex's heart. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The life he had known was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. The next morning, Alex woke to the sound of a car pulling up in Mrs. Thompson's driveway. His heart leaped into his throat as he recognized the familiar sound of his father's truck. Jack had returned. The moment of truth had arrived. Mrs. Thompson had already let Jack inside by the time Alex stumbled downstairs, still groggy from a restless night. Jack's face was a mix of confusion and worry as he stood in the doorway, his eyes darting between Mrs. Thompson and Alex. "Alex, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice heavy with concern. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, Mrs. Thompson stepped in. "Jack, I think you should sit down. There's something you need to know." As they all sat down around Mrs. Thompson's kitchen table, Alex could feel the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. He could see the questions swirling in his father's eyes, the uncertainty, the worry. And when the truth finally came out, when Mrs. Thompson explained what had happened, and Alex filled in the gaps, Jack's face darkened with a mixture of disbelief and anger. But this was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come, and Alex knew that the fallout from Karen's actions would be far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Jack's return was sooner than expected. The next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, the low rumble of his old pickup truck echoed through the quiet neighborhood, pulling up to Mrs. Thompson's driveway. Alex had barely slept the night before. The weight of everything that had happened lay heavy on his mind, and every time he closed his eyes, the image of Karen's cold, unforgiving face haunted him. Now, as he heard the familiar sound of his father's truck, his stomach twisted with a mix of relief and fear. Mrs. Thompson had already woken up early, her usual habit of preparing tea for herself just after dawn still in place despite the strange events of the previous night. She had been kind, offering Alex a place to stay and even reassuring him that they would sort everything out. But the unease lingered. Deep down, Alex knew this was not something that would simply blow over. His father's return meant one thing: confrontation. And nothing about it was going to be easy. The doorbell rang, startling both Alex and Mrs. Thompson. They exchanged a brief glance before she set down her cup and walked toward the door, her movements slow and deliberate. Alex remained frozen in the small living room, staring at the worn carpet as he heard the front door creak open. "Morning, Jack," Mrs. Thompson greeted him, her voice soft and calm. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," Jack replied, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Is Alex here?" "Yes, he's inside. I think you two need to have a talk," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Alex braced himself as his father's heavy boots echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each step. When Jack finally appeared in the doorway, Alex looked up to meet his father's eyes. Jack was a tall man, his face lined with the years of hard labor he had spent working construction, and though his expression was usually kind, now it was clouded with confusion and worry. "Alex," Jack said, his voice low. "What's going on? Mrs. Thompson told me you've been staying here. Why aren't you at home?" Alex opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell his father that Karen, the woman Jack loved, had thrown him out of the house like he was nothing? He had no idea where to start. "It's complicated," Alex finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Complicated?" Jack frowned, stepping further into the room. "What happened? Why didn't you just stay at home?" Before Alex could respond, Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat from the doorway. "Jack, I think you need to sit down for this. There's something you don't know." Jack looked between Alex and Mrs. Thompson, his confusion deepening. He reluctantly lowered himself into the chair across from Alex, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Alex could feel the weight of his father's gaze, waiting, expecting answers. Taking a deep breath, Alex began to tell him everything. He told him about the vase, about how it had accidentally been knocked over while he was cleaning, and how Karen had exploded in anger. He explained how, despite his apologies, she had shown no mercy, accusing him of being worthless and a burden. Finally, Alex recounted the most painful part, how Karen had demanded that he leave the house and not return until Jack came back. He kept his voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of emotions he had tried so hard to hold back the previous night. Jack sat in stunned silence as his son spoke. His usually calm and composed demeanor began to crack as the realization of what had happened hit him. His face grew darker with every word, his jaw clenched, and his hands tightened into fists on his knees. He listened to Alex's story in its entirety without interrupting, but the tension in the room grew palpable. When Alex finished, silence hung in the air once again. Jack's face was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something else Alex couldn't quite identify. Something deeper, like betrayal. "She kicked you out," Jack said finally, his voice low and hard. "She really kicked you out of the house?" Alex nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Jack's expression hardened further. He stood abruptly, his fists still clenched at his sides. "I'm going to talk to her." Before Alex could protest, Jack turned and marched toward the door. Mrs. Thompson, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Jack," she began softly, "you need to be careful how you approach this." But Jack shook his head. "No, she went too far this time. I need to hear it from her." With that, he was out the door, striding toward his truck with a grim determination that made Alex's stomach churn. Mrs. Thompson sighed and sat down beside Alex, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father's going to have a lot to think about after this," she said quietly. "Give him time." But time was the one thing Alex feared he didn't have. He had no idea how this confrontation was going to go. He knew Karen was manipulative, skilled at twisting the truth to make herself look innocent. If she convinced Jack that Alex had been in the wrong, if she managed to weave another one of her lies, everything could fall apart. The drive home felt like it stretched for hours, though in reality it was only a few minutes. Jack's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he navigated the familiar streets. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Karen, The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted to care for his son, had thrown Alex out of the house. The disbelief mixed with anger, and with every passing second, his fury grew. This was not the first time he had sensed tension between Karen and Alex, but he had always brushed it aside, thinking it was just the usual growing pains of a blended family. Now he realized how wrong he had been. When Jack pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, calm, quiet, deceptively normal. But inside, he knew there was a storm brewing. He slammed the truck door shut and strode toward the front door, barely pausing to unlock it before stepping inside. Karen was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, her face calm and composed as if nothing had happened. When she looked up and saw Jack standing in the doorway, her eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Jack, you're home early," she said, her voice smooth and warm. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Jack didn't respond to her greeting. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes dark with anger. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled. Karen raised an eyebrow, her smile fading slightly. "About what?" "About Alex," Jack said sharply, crossing his arms over his chest. "He told me what happened while I was gone. How you kicked him out of the house." Karen's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tightening around her eyes. "Oh, that," she said dismissively, waving a hand. "It was just a misunderstanding. Alex has been acting out lately, and I thought some time away would do him good. You know how teenagers can be, always testing boundaries." Jack's jaw clenched. "You threw him out, Karen. You left him with nowhere to go, no way to contact me. What were you thinking?" Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, her calm demeanor began to crack. "Don't exaggerate, Jack. He's a teenage boy. He can take care of himself for a night. And besides, it was just one night. I didn't mean for it to go that far." "That far?" Jack's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "You threw him out like he was nothing. He's my son, Karen. How could you do that?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression hardening. "I've done nothing but try to raise that boy with respect, but he's been difficult since day one. He never listens, he's lazy, and he doesn't appreciate anything I do for him. You've been gone most of the time, Jack. You don't know what it's like to deal with him every day. That doesn't give you the right to throw him out of his own home." Jack snapped, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "He's still a kid, Karen. You don't just abandon him like that." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Jack could see the wheels turning in Karen's mind, the careful calculation behind her eyes as she tried to find a way to deflect the blame. But this time, Jack wasn't going to let her twist the truth. "He's staying with Mrs. Thompson for now," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "And I need to think about what happens next." Karen's eyes widened, and for the first time, real fear flashed across her face. "What do you mean, what happens next?" "Jack, you're not seriously considering." "I don't know, Karen," Jack interrupted, his voice tired and heavy. "I need time to figure this out. I need to think about what's best for Alex." With that, Jack turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Karen standing in stunned silence. As he stepped back into Jack stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hitting him like a cold slap. His head was buzzing, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. The confrontation with Karen had been harder than he imagined, and yet it felt far from over. He had confronted her, yes, but the truth was, he didn't know what to believe anymore. The woman he had married, the one he thought he knew so well, had thrown his son out of their home, a place that should have been safe. His own flesh and blood, left alone and vulnerable, while she sat inside their comfortable house, pretending like nothing was wrong. The weight of it all was unbearable. He looked around at the empty street, the sky still overcast and threatening rain, though the clouds had yet to deliver. There was a dull ache building behind his eyes, a headache born of stress and confusion. His mind wandered back to the early days of his marriage to Karen, when everything seemed so hopeful. She had come into his life when he was still grieving the loss of Alex's mother, and for a while, it had felt like a second chance. Karen had been charming, caring, or at least, she appeared to be. He had thought she could be the woman who would help them rebuild their broken family. But now, standing outside the house they shared, Jack felt like a fool. How had he not seen it? How had he missed the signs? He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to collect himself. He needed to get Alex. Mrs. Thompson had been kind enough to take him in, but Jack couldn't leave his son there indefinitely. He needed to fix this, though he had no idea how. His marriage, his family, everything was hanging by a thread. Jack climbed back into his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He didn't turn the engine on right away. Instead, he stared through the windshield at nothing in particular, trying to piece together the fragments of his thoughts. Karen's accusations against Alex, that he was lazy, difficult, ungrateful, they didn't line up with the boy Jack knew. Alex wasn't perfect, sure, but he was a good kid. He had never given Jack reason to believe otherwise. And yet here they were. With a heavy sigh, Jack turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. He pulled out of the driveway and headed toward Mrs. Thompson's house, the short distance giving him just enough time to rehearse what he might say to Alex. But when he arrived, he found himself standing in front of the door, his mind a blank slate. Mrs. Thompson answered almost immediately, her sharp eyes softening when she saw Jack standing there, looking more lost than she'd ever seen him. She had known Jack for years, watched him raise Alex after his wife's death, and she knew him to be a decent man, someone who loved his son more than anything. But now she could see the toll that the past few days had taken on him. "Come in, Jack," she said gently, stepping aside to let him in. "Alex is in the living room." Jack nodded his thanks and stepped inside, the warmth of Mrs. Thompson's house a stark contrast to the cold tension that had filled his own home. As he walked into the living room, he saw Alex sitting on the couch, his shoulders hunched, his face a mixture of worry and exhaustion. When their eyes met, Jack felt a pang of guilt so deep it almost made him stagger. He had failed his son. He had let this happen. "Hey, kiddo," Jack said, his voice gruff but soft, as he sat down next to Alex on the couch. Alex glanced up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Hi, Dad." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was thick, both of them unsure how to begin the conversation they knew had to happen. "I talked to Karen," Jack finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between them. "She told me her side of the story, but I wanted to hear from you again. I need to know what really happened." Alex hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He had already told his father the truth, but there was a part of him that feared his father still wouldn't believe him. After all, Karen had a way of twisting things, of making people see her version of events as the only truth. But the look in Jack's eyes told Alex that this time, his father was ready to listen. "I didn't do anything, Dad," Alex said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration and hurt. "It was just an accident. I was cleaning and the vase fell over. I didn't mean for it to break. But Karen, she just lost it. She started yelling, saying I was worthless, that I was nothing but a burden. And then she told me to get out." Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting Alex's words sink in. He believed him. Of course he did. How could he not? The boy sitting next to him was his son, the one person Jack had always been able to count on, even when things were hard. He opened his eyes again, looking at Alex with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I'm sorry, Alex," Jack said, his voice rough. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have known something was wrong. You shouldn't have had to go through this alone." Alex shrugged, but Jack could see the pain in his eyes. "It's not your fault, Dad. Karen she doesn't like me. I've known that for a long time. Jack's heart sank at those words. How had he let things get this bad? He had always assumed that Karen's tension with Alex was just part of the growing pains of blending a family, but now he realized that it went much deeper than that. Karen didn't just dislike Alex, she resented him. And Jack had been too blind, too focused on making his marriage work, to see it. "We'll figure this out," Jack said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure how to fix things, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to protect Alex. Whatever happened next, his son's well-being had to come first. Before Jack could say anything more, Mrs. Thompson returned to the living room, a tray of tea in her hands. She set it down on the coffee table and took a seat in the armchair across from them, her expression kind but serious. "You need to think carefully about what you're going to do, Jack," she said gently, her eyes locking with his. "This isn't just about one argument or a broken vase. Karen's behavior isn't something that's going to change overnight. You need to consider what's best for Alex and for yourself." Jack nodded, knowing she was right. But what could he do? His marriage to Karen had been his attempt to rebuild a family after losing his first wife. Now that family was crumbling, and he wasn't sure if it could be saved, or if it even should be. "I need time to think," Jack said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to figure out what the right thing to do is." Mrs. Thompson nodded in understanding, but Alex's expression grew more anxious. "What about me, Dad?" he asked, his voice small. "Am I going back home?" Jack looked at his son, seeing the fear and uncertainty written on his face. He couldn't take Alex back into that house, not until he knew what the future held. He couldn't ask his son to live under the same roof as Karen, not after everything that had happened. "You'll stay here with Mrs. Thompson for now, if that's okay," Jack said, glancing at the older woman. "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "Alex can stay as long as he needs to." Alex nodded, though Jack could see the disappointment in his eyes. He wanted to go home, but Jack knew that wasn't an option right now. There was too much unresolved, too much anger and hurt to sort through. But one thing was clear: his son came first. Later that day, as Jack drove away from Mrs. Thompson's house, the weight of his decision settled over him. The future was uncertain. His marriage, his family, everything was hanging in the balance. But for the first time in a long time, Jack knew where his priorities lay. He would protect Alex, no matter what. If that meant ending his marriage, then so be it. Karen had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. As he pulled into the driveway of his own house, Jack sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the front door. The home he had built with Karen suddenly felt foreign, like a place he no longer recognized. He knew that once he stepped inside, everything would change. But Jack was ready. He had to be, for Alex. And with that thought, he opened the truck door and stepped out, ready to face whatever came next. As Jack stepped into the house, the familiar creak of the front door felt different. The quiet that usually offered him a moment of peace after a long day felt suffocating now, heavy with tension and uncertainty. The home he had once shared with Karen, filled with the hope of rebuilding a family, now felt like an alien place. Each corner of the house seemed to echo the distance between them, the cracks in their relationship growing more evident with every passing moment. He stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the silence, and then he heard it, the soft clatter of dishes coming from the kitchen. Karen was still there, pretending nothing had happened, just as she had the day before. Jack's chest tightened. He wasn't ready for another confrontation, but it was unavoidable. This time, though, things were different. He knew he couldn't continue living this lie, pretending that everything would work itself out. Too much had been said, too much had been revealed, and the damage Karen had inflicted on Alex couldn't be ignored. Taking a deep breath, Jack walked toward the kitchen, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he stepped into the doorway, Karen was standing by the sink, rinsing off a dish, her back turned to him. The sight of her moving so casually, as though nothing had changed, made Jack's jaw tighten. Karen glanced over her shoulder as she heard him enter, her face still calm, but her eyes flickered with something darker, a recognition that this was no ordinary conversation. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned to face him, her arms crossing over her chest defensively, as if she were already preparing for a fight. "Jack," she said, her voice measured and neutral, though there was an edge to it. "Have you had time to think things over?" Jack didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, taking in the woman he had once loved, the woman he had thought would help him rebuild after so much loss. But now, all he could see was the woman who had hurt his son, the woman who had driven a wedge between them. "Yeah," Jack finally said, his voice low but firm. "I've thought a lot about it." Karen raised an eyebrow, but her expression remained guarded. And I'm not sure where we go from here," Jack replied, each word weighed with meaning. "You crossed a line with Alex. You threw him out of the house. You treated him like he didn't matter, like he wasn't part of this family. I can't just forget that." Karen's face hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't throw him out, Jack. I gave him space. He needed to learn that his actions have consequences. He's not some innocent child. He's been disrespectful, lazy, and ungrateful for years. I've tried to make things work with him, but he never wanted me here in the first place." Jack shook his head, his frustration bubbling up. "That's not true, Karen. He's a kid. He's still figuring things out. And yeah, it's been hard for him to adjust, but that doesn't give you the right to treat him the way you did. You didn't give him space. You abandoned him." Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line, her voice rising with indignation. "I didn't abandon him. I was teaching him responsibility. You're too soft on him, Jack. You always have been. He takes advantage of you because he knows you'll let him get away with anything." "Get away with anything." Jack's voice grew sharper, his anger finally breaking through. "He broke a vase, Karen. A vase. And you reacted by kicking him out of his own home. That's not teaching responsibility. That's cruelty. He's my son, my responsibility. And you went too far." For a moment, Karen said nothing. The two of them stood facing each other, the kitchen feeling smaller, more claustrophobic with every second of silence that passed between them. Jack could see the gears turning in her head, the way she was trying to figure out how to turn the situation in her favor. That was Karen's way, always controlling, always manipulating. But this time, Jack wasn't going to let her. "You always take his side," Karen finally snapped, her voice icy. "No matter what I do, I'm always the villain. I've tried to make this family work, Jack. I gave up so much to be with you, to be a part of this life, and you've never appreciated it. You've always put Alex first, and now look where we are. You're choosing him over me, again." Jack felt a surge of frustration at her words, but it was tinged with something else. Sadness. Sadness because there was a time when he had believed in this marriage, believed that Karen could be a real partner, a mother figure to Alex. But now, hearing her words, he realized just how far apart they had drifted, how much bitterness had built up between them. "This isn't about choosing sides," Jack said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "This is about what's right. You crossed a line, Karen, and I can't just ignore that. I can't pretend everything's fine when you've hurt my son. I can't live like this." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it, Jack saw something else. Fear. For all her bluster, for all her confidence, Karen knew she was losing control. She had always been good at manipulating situations, at bending people to her will. But this time, things were different. Jack was standing his ground. "So what are you saying, Jack?" Karen asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Are you saying this is the end? Are you throwing me out now too?" Jack didn't answer right away. His mind raced, filled with memories of the life they had built together, the years they had spent trying to make this marriage work. But now, standing in this kitchen, With the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him, he realized that he couldn't continue down this path. Not for Karen, not for the sake of appearances, and definitely not at the expense of his son's well-being. "I don't know what I'm saying," Jack admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But I do know that things can't stay the way they are. I need to protect Alex. And if that means we need to take a break, if that means we need to figure things out separately, then maybe that's what has to happen." Karen's face twisted with disbelief, her eyes widening. "You can't be serious. After everything I've done for this family, after all the sacrifices I've made." Jack felt a flicker of guilt, but he quickly pushed it aside. Karen had made sacrifices, yes, but so had he. And so had Alex. And now it was clear that the cost of staying in this marriage was too high. "I'm sorry, Karen," Jack said, his voice soft but resolute. "I am. But I can't ignore what's happened. I can't pretend that things are fine when they're not." Karen stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness, any hint that he might waver. But Jack held firm, his decision made. Slowly the fight seemed to drain out of her, her shoulders slumping as she realized that this time she wasn't going to win. "Fine," Karen said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If that's how you want it." Jack nodded, though the victory felt hollow. This wasn't what he had wanted. He hadn't married Karen with the hope of ending up here, standing in a cold kitchen, on the brink of losing everything they had built together. But now he saw that holding on to this marriage was only making things worse. It wasn't just hurting him, it was hurting Alex too. "I'll go stay with my sister for a while," Karen said, her voice clipped, as though she were already distancing herself from the situation. "You can have your precious son back. I'm done fighting for something that was never mine to begin with." Jack felt the sting of her words, but he didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As Karen turned and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the empty hallway, Jack stood alone, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. He had made his decision, but the fallout was only just beginning. He knew that Alex would feel the consequences of this too, and he dreaded the conversation they would need to have. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet, letting the silence of the house settle around him like a thick fog. Later, as Jack sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, photos that now seemed like relics of a different life, he felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. What would the future look like without Karen? How would he and Alex move forward from this? Would things ever be normal again? He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that the road ahead was going to be hard, and there was no going back. And yet, amid all the uncertainty, there was one thing Jack was sure of. He had made the right choice. For Alex, for himself, for the chance to rebuild their lives without the weight of Karen's resentment hanging over them. As the hours passed, Jack finally rose from the couch, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. It was still cloudy, and the wind had picked up. Jack stood by the window, watching as the clouds thickened, swirling like a storm ready to break. His reflection in the glass looked older, more worn than he remembered. This was a moment he never thought he'd face. Alone in the house that had once promised to be a fresh start, now hollow and filled with the aftermath of decisions that couldn't be undone. The silence around him was no longer the comforting calm it had once been. It was oppressive, like the weight of everything he had just lost pressing down on him. He had never imagined his marriage to Karen would unravel like this. The woman who had once seemed like a lifeline, a second chance at family after the loss of Alex's mother, had turned into someone unrecognizable. Or perhaps, Jack thought bitterly, she had always been this way, and he had been too blinded by his own desperation to see it. Karen had left just an hour ago, storming out with her suitcase in tow, her parting words still echoing in his mind. "You'll regret this, Jack, you'll see." He wasn't sure if she meant those words as a threat or as some twisted form of self-pity, But either way, they hung in the air like an unresolved tension that wasn't going to dissipate anytime soon. He had watched her drive away, not out of bitterness, but out of an odd sense of finality, as if he needed to witness the physical departure to accept the emotional one. Now, as he stood in the empty living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life they had built together, Jack felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. The house seemed too quiet, almost haunted by the ghosts of what could have been. He took a deep breath and turned away from the window, walking back toward the kitchen. His mind buzzed with unfinished thoughts, the future looming over him like a vast, unknown landscape. There was so much left to figure out, not just for himself, but for Alex. He needed to tell his son what had happened, though he suspected Alex would already know. He wasn't a kid anymore. He could read the writing on the wall. But still, Jack dreaded the conversation. How could he explain all of this to his son? How could he tell Alex that everything they had tried to salvage had fallen apart, and now they were starting over again? Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in lazy curls, but the bitter taste did little to soothe his anxiety. He sat down at the kitchen table, running a hand over the smooth wood, remembering all the mornings spent here, pretending that things were fine, that their family was just like any other. But it hadn't been fine for a long time, had it? He had just been too stubborn, too hopeful, to admit it. He thought back to the early days of his relationship with Karen, the way they had met in the wake of his grief, both of them searching for something they had lost. Karen had seemed like the answer back then. A strong, confident woman who had swept into his life at a time when he felt like he was drowning. She had been patient at first, understanding of his loss, and willing to help him raise Alex. But somewhere along the way, the cracks had started to show. Maybe it had always been there, Jack reflected. The resentment she felt toward Alex, the jealousy of his bond with his son, and the way she had never truly accepted her role in their family. But Jack had ignored it, hoping things would get better with time. He had convinced himself that the tension between them was just the natural friction of blending a family. That was normal, wasn't it? But now, looking back, he realized how wrong he had been. The tension hadn't been natural. It had been Karen's growing resentment, her unwillingness to see Alex as anything but an obstacle. And Jack had let it happen, had turned a blind eye to the way she treated his son, all because he wanted so badly for this to work. The coffee in his cup had gone cold by the time Jack finally stood up. The weight of the past few days pressed on him, but there was no time to dwell on it. He needed to go back to Mrs. Thompson's to see Alex and try to figure out what came next for them. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this situation was easy, but at least now, Jack knew where his priorities lay. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even Karen, come between him and his son again. When Jack pulled up to Mrs. Thompson's house, the wind had picked up, rattling the trees along the narrow street. The house was a small, cozy cottage that felt welcoming in a way his own home hadn't in years. Mrs. Thompson, with her quiet wisdom and unwavering kindness, had always been a pillar in their lives. He knew Alex had been in good hands staying with her, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. He should have protected his son from this mess long ago. He should have seen the signs. He knocked gently on the door, and it wasn't long before Mrs. Thompson answered. Her kind eyes met Jack's with a look that said she already knew everything that had happened without a word needing to be exchanged. "Come in, Jack," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Alex was sitting on the couch, his head down, flipping through a comic book, but not really reading it. When he saw his father enter, he put the comic aside, his eyes filled with questions. Jack took a deep breath and sat down next to him. "Alex," he began, his voice low, careful, "I know things have been rough lately, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Karen, she's gone. She's staying with her sister for a while, and I don't know what's going to happen after that." Alex looked at his father, his expression a mixture of confusion and sadness, but there was also something else. Relief. "So, it's just us now?" Alex asked, his voice cautious, like he wasn't sure if it was okay to feel relieved. Jack nodded. Yeah, it's just us, kiddo. I'm not going to let anything come between us again. I should have stepped in sooner. I should have listened to you. I'm sorry I didn't. Alex didn't say anything for a moment, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. It's not your fault, Dad, he said quietly. I mean, I knew Karen didn't like me. But I never wanted you to be stuck between us. I just didn't know what to do. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. How had it come to this? His son, feeling like a burden, like he had to endure the tension in their home for the sake of his father's happiness. You're never a burden, Alex. Never. I should have seen what was happening. Jack stopped, searching for the right words. I just wanted to fix things. I wanted to make it work, but I realize now that trying to force this family to be something it wasn't only hurt you. Alex nodded, not saying much, but Jack could see the understanding in his eyes. The boy had been through more than any teenager should have to deal with, and Jack felt a pang of guilt knowing he had let it get this far. We're going to be okay, Jack continued, his voice steady, even though he wasn't sure of anything anymore. It might not feel like it now, but we will be. We'll figure it out, together. Alex gave a small nod, and for the first time in what felt like ages, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything that had happened still hanging over them, but there was something different in the air now. A sense of release, like the storm had passed, and they could finally begin to rebuild. Mrs. Thompson returned from the kitchen with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, placing them gently on the coffee table before retreating to give them space. Jack sipped the warm drink, feeling its heat spread through him, a welcome contrast to the cold weight that had settled in his chest over the past few days. After a long moment, Alex spoke again. What happens now? Jack sighed, staring into the mug in his hands. I don't know. We'll take things one day at a time. We'll figure out what's best for us. Maybe we stay here for a while. Maybe we move somewhere new. But whatever happens, we'll do it together. Alex nodded, his expression softening. And for the first time in what felt like months, Jack saw a glimpse of the boy he knew. The boy who still had hope for the future. As the night deepened outside, Jack realized that, while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. They had each other, and that, more than anything, was what mattered most. They could weather whatever came next, together. And with that thought, Jack leaned back, letting the warmth of the moment settle over him. It wasn't the future he had envisioned, but maybe, just maybe, it was the one they needed. In the weeks that followed Karen's departure, the house on Maple Street began to feel different, as if the air had lightened. Jack noticed it immediately, though it was hard to explain. The tension that had once suffocated every corner of the home was gone, leaving a quiet stillness in its place. It wasn't exactly peaceful yet. There was too much left to process, too many wounds that still needed time to heal. But for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he could breathe. Alex, too, seemed to change. At first, he had been hesitant, unsure how to act now that Karen was no longer in the picture. He had grown used to walking on eggshells around her, never quite certain if his actions would trigger one of her outbursts. But as the days turned into weeks, Jack noticed that his son's shoulders didn't seem as tense, that he was laughing more, speaking more freely, like he was finally able to be himself again. It was a subtle transformation, but one that filled Jack with a bittersweet sense of relief. Bitter because it made him realize just how much Alex had suffered in silence, but sweet because it meant that things were finally starting to get better. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Jack sat at the dining table with a takeout pizza between them. It had become a sort of tradition since Karen left. Neither of them felt like cooking much, so they often ordered in, sitting together in the quiet house, talking about school, work, and whatever else came to mind. Jack cherished these moments. It reminded him of the early days, when it had just been him and Alex after his first wife passed away. Those were tough times, but there had been a simple, unspoken bond between them. A bond that Jack realized had been eroded by the years of tension with Karen. As they ate, Jack couldn't help but notice how Alex seemed different. His face wasn't clouded with worry anymore. There was a lightness in his expression that Jack hadn't seen in a long time. They talked about school, about a new project Alex was working on in his science class, and for a while, everything felt normal, like they had finally found their footing again. But there was still an elephant in the room, and Jack knew they couldn't avoid it forever. After a long pause, Jack set down his pizza and leaned back in his chair, studying his son's face. "Alex," he began carefully, "I've been thinking about what comes next. About us, the house, everything." Alex looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know things have been tough, and I know we're still figuring things out. But I've been thinking, maybe it's time for a fresh start. I don't know if this house, this place, is the right place for us anymore. There's a lot of history here, and not all of it good." Alex blinked, surprised. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the familiar walls, the furniture that had been there for as long as he could remember. It was their home, but it was also the place where so much had gone wrong. "I don't know," Alex said slowly. "I mean, I get what you're saying, but where would we go?" Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking about moving somewhere new. Maybe not far, maybe just a different neighborhood, a different house, somewhere we can start over. What do you think?" Alex was quiet for a moment, his eyes flicking back and forth as he considered the idea. Jack could see the wheels turning in his son's mind, the way he was processing everything. It wasn't an easy decision. This house held memories, both good and bad, but it was also the place where they had been through so much together. "I think," Alex started, then paused. "I think maybe you're right. It's weird, but ever since Karen left, it doesn't feel like the same house anymore. I don't know if I want to stay here, either." Jack nodded, feeling the strange mixture of relief and sadness. This house had been their home for so many years, and yet it had also become a place filled with tension, arguments, and unresolved pain. Maybe a fresh start was exactly what they needed. They talked about it for the rest of the evening, going back and forth about what kind of place they might look for, what they'd want in a new home. It was a conversation that felt both exciting and daunting, but for the first time in months, Jack felt like they were moving forward, like they were making decisions that would lead to something better. The days continued to pass, and Jack began quietly looking at houses in nearby neighborhoods. He didn't tell Alex at first, wanting to make sure that they found the right place before bringing it up again. But in the meantime, life moved on. Alex returned to school, falling back into the rhythm of his classes, his friends, and his usual routines. Jack noticed how his son seemed lighter, more at ease, and though he didn't say it out loud, Jack knew it was because the weight of Karen's presence was no longer hanging over them. Karen, for her part, hadn't made much of an effort to stay in touch. She had called Jack once or twice in the weeks after she left, mostly to discuss logistics, what to do about the house, whether they would file for divorce, but there had been no attempt to reconcile. Jack wasn't sure if that was a relief or a disappointment. Part of him had expected her to fight harder, to try and manipulate him into taking her back, but she hadn't. Maybe she had known, deep down, that it was over. One day, after weeks of searching, Jack found a house that felt right. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest, two-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood a few miles away. It had a small backyard, perfect for the kind of peaceful evenings Jack had always imagined but never had in their old home. The house felt new, full of possibilities, a blank slate where they could rebuild their lives without the weight of the past hanging over them. Jack brought Alex to see the house one Saturday afternoon, and as they walked through the rooms, Jack could see his son's eyes light up. It wasn't just the house itself, it was what it represented. A new beginning, A chance to leave behind the memories of Karen's anger, the tension, the fear of never knowing what would set her off next. This house was theirs, and they could fill it with whatever future they wanted. When they left the house, Jack turned to Alex, watching him carefully. "So, what do you think? Is this the one?" Alex smiled, a real, genuine smile that Jack hadn't seen in a long time. "Yeah, Dad, I think it is." And so the decision was made. Over the next few weeks, they packed up their things, going through the old house one last time. There were moments when Jack felt a pang of sadness, packing up old family photos, sorting through the things that had once belonged to his late wife, things that reminded him of the life they had once shared. But as he did, he realized that those memories weren't tied to the house. They were tied to him and Alex, to the bond they shared. And no matter where they went, that would never change. On the day of the move, Mrs. Thompson came by to help, her gentle presence a comfort as they loaded boxes into the truck. She had been there through it all, a steady anchor in the storm, and Jack couldn't thank her enough for the support she had given him and Alex. As they drove away from the house for the last time, Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the familiar sight of Maple Street faded into the distance. He felt a strange sense of closure, like a chapter of his life was ending, but not with bitterness. It was time to move on, time to let go of the past and focus on the future. When they arrived at the new house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the quiet street. Jack and Alex stood in the driveway for a moment, taking it all in. This was their new beginning, their new life. It wasn't going to be perfect. Jack knew that. But it was a chance to start fresh, to rebuild what had been broken. As they carried the last box inside, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He looked over at Alex, who was already talking excitedly about how he wanted to set up his room, and for the first time in months, Jack allowed himself to believe that things were going to be okay. Later that night, after they had unpacked a few essentials and shared a quiet dinner in their new kitchen, Jack sat out on the small back porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Alex joined him a few minutes later, sitting down next to him, the comfortable silence between them speaking volumes. "Dad," Alex said after a while, his voice soft but steady, Do you think we'll be happy here?" Jack looked at his son, then back up at the sky. "Yeah, I do," he said quietly. "I think we will." And for the first time in a long time, Jack truly believed it. The past was behind them now, and though the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, they were facing it together. And that, Jack thought, was all that really mattered.